21세기 자본주의 사회를 헤쳐나가는 우리에게는 많은 균형 감각이 필요합니다. 이 세상에는 참 많은 유혹이 있죠. 남들은 다 화려하게 살고 있는데 나만 그렇지 못한 것 같은 열등감을 부추겨서 내가 필요한 이상의 소비를 하게 만드는 그런 유혹들도 존재하고요. 또 남들은 다 부동산이나 비트코인 등으로 한탕 번 것 같은데 나만 그렇지 못한 것 같은 불안감을 부추겨서 위험한 투자에 손을 뻗게 하는 유혹들도 많이 존재를 해요. 그런 유혹에 대한 해독제 같은 책이 있어서 오늘 소개해드리려고 하는데, 몰간 하우젤이라는 사람이 쓴 The Psychology of Money, 돈의 심리학이라는 책이에요. 대부분의 경제 관련 책들은 투자에 또는 사업에 성공한 사람들의 이야기를 담고 있어요. 근데 그 사람이 성공하게 되기까지는 그 사람의 성향, 상황, 시대, 특정한 시장의 특성 이런 것들이 어우러져서 그 성공이 만들어진 거기 때문에 그 사람이 어떻게 성공을 했는지 안다 그래서 그걸 내 생활에 적용하기는 거의 불가능한 경우가 많죠. 하지만 모건 하우젤은 굉장히 다른 접근을 해요. 이 책의 제목처럼 돈은 곧 인간의 심리로 움직인다 라는 관점에서 책을 썼어요. 경제라는 것은 어떤 사회나 나라에 있는 사람들이 내리는 선택, 내가 집을 살까 말까, 대출을 받을까 말까, 이직을 할까, 취직을 할까, 창업을 할까, 이런 것들이 모여서 일어나는 것이기 때문에 결국 경제를 이해하기 위해서는 그 경제를 이루는 구성원인 인간을 알아야 된다. 내가 자꾸 잘못된 투자를 하거나 잘못된 경제적 선택을 내린다면 그 선택을 내리는 주체, 즉 나, 그리고 나를 움직이는 원동력, 즉 나의 감정과 관념들을 이해해야만 더 좋은 선택을 내릴 수 있는 길을 볼 수 있다. 돈을 단지 경제학적으로 보는 것이 아니라 경제와 심리 그리고 인문학의 접점에서 본 책이라서 굉장히 신선한 내용이 많았고요. 이 책은 미국 작가가 미국 사회를 토대로 쓴 책입니다. 다시 말하면 많은 미국인들이 가지고 있는 경제에 대한 잘못된 관념이나 습관들을 관찰을 하고 토대가 되고 있는 사회심리학적 요인들을 분석해서 쓴 책이에요. 근데 이 책을 읽으면서 놀랐던 것은 그 중에 얼마나 많은 부분이 한국인에게도 적용이 되는지였어요. 모건 하우젤이 말하는 남들과 비교하기 좋아하고 질투를 하는 인간의 성향이라든지 크게 성공한 사람만을 주목하기 때문에 천천히 조심조심 성공을 이룬 사람들은 묻혀버리는 사회적 현상, 이런 것들은 미국이나 우리나라랑 똑같다라는 생각을 했고요. 우리가 잘못된 경제적 선택을 하게 하는 인간 심리에 해당하는 한국 기사 내용을 발췌해서 몰간 하우젤에게 어떻게 생각하는지를 직접 줌콜로 연결을 해서 물어보기로 했어요. You quote Charlie Munger, who said, "Economy is not actually driven by greed, but by jealousy." Well,
yeah, it's driven by envy. I think that's really true.
it was really interesting for me to see an American write this because Koreans think that we have a monopoly on social envy.
Is that true?
Yes. Like we obsess about how social competition, status competition in Korea is really extreme. We imagine because we have a collectivist culture, we care a lot about how we look in the eyes of other people. Whereas we imagine because Americans are more individualistic, they probably won't care so much how other people look at them.
Oh, that's so fascinating. I had no idea that that was the case. That's all news to me, but that's fascinating to hear.
There was even an article on CNBC in the beginning of last year. So this was published in January 13th of 2023. The investment bank estimated South Korean total spending on personal luxury goods grew 24% in 2022 to $16.8 billion, or about $325 per capita. That's far more than $55 and $280 per capita spent by Chinese and American nationals, respectively, according to Morgan Stanley estimates.
Thank you for sharing that. I really had no idea about. I think it's possible that if you quantified envy, however you would do that, that maybe Americans are lower than other countries. I don't know that to be true, but maybe that is the case. But I see it everywhere. As someone who was born and raised in America, you see it everywhere. And maybe we just do it differently. Maybe in other cultures, it's luxury goods, handbags and clothes and whatnot. In America, it's my house needs to be bigger than yours. I need to earn a higher salary than yours. Like maybe it's just a different way to get across your envy. But I think whether it is Korea or the United States, it's a human thing to be envious of others. Life in many senses is a competition for resources. And what matters is not how many resources do I have. What matters is, do I have more resources than you? Envy from an evolutionary perspective makes a lot of sense. And I think you see it in virtually every culture, maybe to different degrees, but it's everywhere.
Why did you say the social competition really intensified in the US in the 1950s and 60s, whereas the wealth gap was much larger in the Gilded Age or in the 1920s Jazz Age, as we see in the Gatsby movies?
Well, I think what really happened in the 1950s is for a very brief period of time after the end of World War II, wealth inequality in the United States and across a lot of the Western world got very small. And so that created this kind of shared mentality in the United States that like we all grow together. And some people are going to do better than others, but when the economy does well, everybody does well. And that created a belief that like, if you, my neighbor, if you're sending your kids to a good college, I deserve that too, because you're not working harder than I am. And so if you, my neighbor, if you have a big house, I deserve one too. I'm generalizing, but I think that was a collective sense that permeated through society. And then as wealth inequality started to grow in the 1970s and more so in the 1980s, now you might be in a situation where your neighbor is earning a lot more money than you. But if your belief is, well, if his kids can go to private college, mine should be able to as well. What that created was the people who are not earning as much money filled that gap with debt. Is really what they did. They had this idea that like, if you can buy a big house, I deserve a big house too. You can probably afford it because you earn a lot of money. I don't. That means I just have to go into debt to chase what you have. And so I think it culminated in many ways in 2008 with the financial crisis. That was the culmination of 30 years of debt-fueled consumption in the United States and all over the world. And I think the core of that debt fuel consumption came from people trying to keep up with another segment of society who was doing much better than them and anchoring their expectations and their aspirations to them.
Some people who are buying expensive cars or expensive jewelry or clothing, they would say that I'm not actually doing it out of jealousy. They would say that this gives me access to a network of people who are better off than I am. And I can use the information or the opportunities that this create to actually even make bigger money later.
The one thing I would say is like, I would make a difference between practical utility and social utility. Practical utility, I would say, is like something that provides, like makes your life better. It's like a comfortable bed, comfortable clothes, dry rain boots. Like there's like practical utility to them. And it's very easy to measure. It's easy to understand what you get out of it. Social utility is real, but it's very hard to measure. It's very hard to understand what you're getting. It's easy to overestimate the benefits, maybe easy to underestimate the benefits some of the time. It's just much harder to put your finger on what it is. So I think a lot of people get fooled by social utility, even if it has a very practical value. The other thing I might add is like, you're going to get the most social utility out of groups and friends who don't care how you're dressing. If your social group will only let you into that group if you dress a certain way, that's probably not a group that's going to like actually propel your career. Maybe I'm overstating that. There are cases where it would be, but I think you're actually going to get the most leverage out of people who value you for your ideas and your intelligence and your wisdom and whatnot. I mean, if you had a choice between, let's say you have cancer and you need surgery, and you have a young doctor who just graduated from college, but he dresses very well, or an older doctor who's been doing this surgery for 30 years, but he's overweight and kind of a slob and he has like grease stains on his jacket, who would you pick? It would be obvious for me. I would be like, I would just want a good doctor. I don't care what you're wearing. I could not care less. And I think that applies to a lot of things. Like if you are only being judged off of your appearance, that's probably not where you're going to get the most leverage in your career.
And I guess that's why, like you're saying, when you're 22 and you really don't have experience to show for it, that's when you're most obsessed with luxury goods and flashy cars, because that's the only thing that you have to be judged by.
I so agree with that. It's so true. It's like when I was young, at least, I didn't know anything. I was an idiot. I didn't have any intelligence. I didn't have any wisdom. I didn't have any humor. I had nothing to offer except I could try to say, hey, aren't these jeans cool? Hey, I have Dolce & Gabbana sunglasses. Isn't that awesome? Because I had nothing else to offer. But then I think as you get older and then you're like, hey, at least to my friends and also to my wife, I could offer intelligence, wisdom, philosophy, humor, love, caring, support, empathy. Maybe I can offer those. And therefore, my need to show you my Dolce & Gabbana sunglasses is much lower than it was when I was 22.
Now, who you're comparing yourself to is probably a fake multimillionaire, not even like a real multimillionaire, a fake multimillionaire who lives in, I don't know, one of those tax havens like Dubai or Monaco, flying private jets to different events and have Bugatti in every color imaginable. Like that's who you're comparing yourself to. Because their expectation has gotten so high, a lot of the younger people feel that in order to attain their goals, only people that it's worth to benchmark are the likes of Elon Musk. If their goal is like to be a billionaire, right, they need to benchmark people who made it really, really big. And what was really surprising in your book was that benchmarking billionaires is one of the worst financial decisions that you can make. These are not people that you want to copy.
Yes, and you made I think a more important point where like a lot of the people who you're benchmarking to on social media are fake. There's this thing I read this many years ago that there is a thriving market to rent a private jet on the tarmac by the minute. And so you literally, the plane never leaves the ground, but you can go to a private jet, go in the cabin, sit in the seat and take a picture of yourself. Because what those people do is that they then take those pictures and upload them onto Instagram and say, look at me in my private jet. But they actually just paid $50 to take a picture of it on the tarmac. I think that actually does real poisonous damage to society. I think you should not benchmark yourself into anyone that you don't know on a deep personal level. If you're benchmarking yourself to strangers or even people who you know, but only at a superficial level, you're not getting the full picture of who that person is. Take Elon Musk, for example. I might be getting some of these numbers wrong, but I think when he left PayPal, he made I think it was $100 million. And I think he put like 60 million into SpaceX and 30 million into Tesla, something like that. He took everything that he had just made, a dynastic amount of money that he could have lived like a king for the rest of his life. He took all of it and put it on these two companies that seemed like ridiculous, crazy ideas at the time. I would not do that. If I sold a company for $100 million, I would buy a mansion and probably a private jet, and no one would ever hear from me ever again. but he's not going to do that. He's going to be like, I'm going to Mars and I'm going to build electric cars. And I think most people would be closer to me. And so those people who achieve that level of success have a risk tolerance and a drive that is completely not normal relative to the rest of us. I want to have the ambition of Elon Musk. Almost certainly you don't. It's not something that you can pick. It's just he's wired differently than you are.
한국의 한 커뮤니티 글이 유행을 한 적이 있는데 그 글에 의하면 한국인들을 가장 괴롭게 하는 우리나라의 문화적 특성 중에 하나가 평균 올려치기다라는 말이 있어요. 뭐 예를 들어서 우리나라에서 인서울을 가는 사람이라면 이미 한국 학력의 탑 15%, 20% 정도에 들어가는데도 인서울을 나왔다 그러면은 뭐 공부 평균 정도 했나 보네 라고 생각하는 등 실제 평균에 비해서 사람들의 평균에 대해서 가지고 있는 관념이 굉장히 높다는 거죠. 그러다 보니까 대다수의 사람들이 나는 평균만큼도 살지 못하고 있다고 생각을 하고 이런 심리 때문에 불행해지는 경우가 많다라는 글이 굉장히 많은 공감을 받았던 것을 기억합니다.
Even if we try to adapt the philosophy of shooting for moderate amount of result for the extended period of time, people are very bad at judging what moderate means. There was a newspaper article about a year and a half ago in Korea where a journalist went out and asked a bunch of Korean people what a median Korean looks like. They said a median Korean, and therefore the class that I have to stay in to at least be an average Korean person, has a 4-year college degree from a university in city of Seoul, work for a mid-sized or large company with a stable salary, own their own apartment, and have enough savings for marriage, children's education, and retirement. That's what they were shooting for. On the surface, that seems like a pretty reasonable set of goals. But what this newspaper found out was when you compare that to actual statistics of what an average Korean person has, these are a much higher goal than people think they are. So for example, only 25% of Korean people buy their own home before they are 40. Only 11% of Koreans went to a 4-year university in city of Seoul. Only 27% of Koreans have corporate or government jobs. And in 2023, median monthly income in Korea was 2.65 million won, which translates to about $2,100.
I think we see this in the United States too, a slightly different statistic. If you interview people who are in the top 10%, even in the top 1% of the income distribution, many of them will consider themselves middle class. If you earn more than 99% of society, that person will say, I'm middle class. So that's almost in the other direction of people just don't know where they sit on the spectrum. I think it's very common in many societies to think that people have it easier than you. Part of that is because people advertise what they're good at and hide their flaws. And therefore, when you're looking at other people, it looks like their life is better than it is. They look happier than you. Because you are very cognizant of your own stress and your own anxiety that you keep inside of your head, but you're blind to everybody else's. I think that's probably where a lot of this comes. And it leaves you with this idea that everyone is doing better than I am. And you could probably extrapolate that to, I'm sure everyone's making more money than I am. I'm sure everyone is smarter than I am. So I think what that is showing is just like a natural sense of imposter syndrome. That even if people are doing well, it's the idea of but everyone else is probably doing better. Everyone else is probably smarter than me.
So for example, if you see a friend who just bought an enormous house, you don't know how much his mortgage payments are or how much is extended his mortgage over the years or, whether it's falling behind the payment. You don't see that. You just see a big house.
I remember when I was in college, I worked at a hotel. There's a guy at the hotel who I was kind of friends with, and he was a security guard. Now, a security guard at a hotel probably makes $8 an hour. Not a lot of money. He was a great guy, but not a lot of money. And he came into work one time in a brand new Chrysler 300 that had 4 TVs in the back of the headrest, 22-inch rims, like a completely ridiculous decked out car. And I remember I was asking him, and I was like, how did you pay for this? And he goes, man, I took out so much. He was like, the debt that I took out of this, he was like, I don't know how I'm ever going to make these monthly payments, but like, I'm going to try. Nobody would know unless you were friends with him that he was making $8 an hour and stood no chance of making the loan payment on this car. But yes, I think the general idea of when you see somebody driving a nice car, the only thing you know about them is that they have less money than they did before they bought that car. You have no idea how much money they earn. You have no idea what their net worth is. And that goes in both directions. If you see someone driving a cheap car, that might be a multimillionaire. You have no idea. You judge other people's wealth by their house, their car, their clothes. And that is a very imperfect way to measure wealth.
I love the quote from your book where you say, wealth is money you didn't spend.
우리나라에도 5년이나 10년 전에 워렌 버핏이나 그레햄 같은 가치 투자자들의 철학이 인기를 끌었습니다. 중산층이 부자가 되는 가장 확실한 방법은 내가 버는 돈보다 적은 돈을 쓰고 그 남은 돈을 안정된 지수에 투자를 하고 20년, 30년 기다리는 것이라는 것을 논리적으로는 누구나 알고 있죠. 이 워렌 버핏의 철학을 실제로 실천하기는 굉장히 어렵습니다. 그래서 몰간 하우젤에게 왜 이렇게 정답을 다 알고 있는 사람들도 실제로 자기 돈이 걸려 있을 때는 합리적인 판단을 하기가 어렵고 잘못된 매수와 매도 타이밍에 휩쓸리게 되는지에 대해서 물어봤어요.
You said that if there's one book on investment, it should be called Shut Up and Wait. And I also love your Napoleon quote. Great general is the man who can do the average thing when all those around him are going crazy. What I'm wondering is that Warren Buffett and his acolytes have become big in any middle-class investment circle. I think in Korea as well, people know that if you can average, 5-6% over 20 years, you are going to become a rich man indeed. So why is it that they've read Warren Buffett, they've read Graham, they know that time in the market is better than timing the market, like they know all this in their head, but when the stock price goes down, why do they panic? And why do they feel like this time it's going to be the real generational recession?
If I were to ask you, how would you feel if the stock market fell 30%? By and large, you imagine a world in which everything is the same as it is today, except stock prices are 30% cheaper. And in that world, most people will be like, oh, that'd be an opportunity. Everything is the same, except prices are 30% lower. That'd be great. But then if I said, how would you feel if stocks fell 30%? Because there was a new virus called COVID that might kill you and your family, has shut down your children's school, has shut down your workplace. And all the experts are saying it's going to get much worse from here. Now, how do you feel? In that context, a lot of people will be like, oh, I don't know if I'd view that as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that's the more realistic thing. So I myself was like this. March of 2020, which was like peak COVID panic and meltdown. I remember talking to the smartest investing friends that I have, people who I have so much respect for. And a lot of them saying, like, this is very, very bad. This is the second Great Depression. And even if it didn't turn out like that, I think they were right to say that. And so I was not buying hand over fist in March of 2020. I was really scared. By the way, you know what actually happened during this period? In February of 2020, Warren Buffett went on CNBC. And this was like the very early days of COVID. We knew that, oh, there's a new respiratory virus, but no one's really panicking about it yet. And someone asked Warren Buffett, they said like, hey, the market's kind of getting wobbly. What are you going to be doing? He said, to paraphrase him, this wasn't exactly what he said, but he said, I don't know what I'm going to be doing next, but I guarantee you I will not be selling. He said those words, I guarantee you I will not be selling. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks later, he sold all of his airline stocks, all of them. I don't think that was hypocritical. Right. I just think once you take in all of the information of what's happening in the world, mm-hmm. your risk tolerance changes considerably. Mm-hmm. And so even for Buffett himself, who started this conversation of like, why can't we do it more like him? There are situations where he does the same thing himself. And I think that's completely fine.
Because we're human.
We're all human, of course, but also the world changes. And I think that was what it was for Buffett. If I have to imagine, I don't know this to be the case, but I imagine that during that period, Buffett was looking at the airline industry and being like, they're going to shut down forever. And also the US government might need to bail them out. And it's not going to look good if Warren Buffett is the largest shareholder of an airline that the US government needs to bail out. So I need to sell because of that. But what's important is that the facts changed. What he said in February no longer applied, not because he was being a hypocrite, but because the world changed around him.
So I understand that in the US, you guys had meme stock debacle involving a company called GameSpot. Yes, we know about that here.
It was a weird thing to watch, yeah.
And in Korea about 2 years ago, we had something very similar. There was a pharmaceutical company called Shinpeng Pharma. whose stock price went from 6,000 won to 200,000 won over about 4-month period. And now it's trading back at 8,000, 9,000. So a lot of people lost their shirts in that trade. And when you look at the people who are making these decisions, they're not like crazy gamblers. They're like level-headed people who are working hard in their daily jobs, but they make these terrible decisions.
Well, I think there could be a couple of things going on. One is there's nothing more appealing in life than easy money. That is such a drug that is hard to ignore for everyone, particularly if they don't like their job or they feel like they're falling behind. They feel like they don't have enough money. If they get some sniff of like, oh, there's easy money being made over here, that's very appealing to people. I think the other thing is like, if you don't have a keen sense of financial history, you might actually think that this company can keep going up forever. Now, if you know financial history, you know that it's just by and large just doesn't exist. The other thing that I think is true and overlooked is that a lot of the people that get swept up in bubbles genuinely think that they will get out before other people. So it's not that they think that this is going to go up forever. They know this is going to end. But the feeling is, yes, this is going to end, but I'm going to sell before that. And everybody thinks that. And by definition, of course, they can't all be right. It's just like a giant game of musical chairs. There's 100 people playing, but there's only 20 chairs. And everyone thinks they're going to get one of those chairs when the music stops. There was a very telling quote from a guy named Chuck Prince, who was the CEO of Citibank in 2007. Citibank, the 2008 financial crisis, came very close to going out of business. It was a disaster. And in 2008, during the mortgage bubble, the housing bubble, Chuck Prince, who was CEO of Citigroup, said, as long as the music is playing, you have to get up and keep dancing. And he was mentioning in the context of like, yes, the housing market is a bubble, but the music's still playing. So we got to keep dancing. We have to keep playing the housing bubble. And I think a lot of people do that in meme stocks too. They're like, look, it's still going up, so I'm not selling yet. When it stops going up, I'll sell. But then everyone has that feeling and all hell breaks loose from there.
이 우리나라는 OECD에서 노인 빈곤율 통계를 집계하기 시작한 2009년 이후로 12년 동안 연속으로 노인 빈곤율이 가장 높은 나라로 알려져 있어요. 얼마 전에 나온 신문 기사에 의하면 이 노인 빈곤율이 높은 큰 이유 중에 하나가 사교육 지출이라는 얘기가 있었습니다. 한국 부모들은 아이가 18살이 될 때까지 한 아이에 약 3억 6천 정도의 돈을 들인다고 하는데요. 이거는 OECD에서 압도적인 일이라고 합니다. 아이 둘을 기르면 거의 7억 정도를 아이들 교육에 썼기 때문에 사실상 자기 노후 대비를 할 수 있는 돈이 남지 않는 거죠. 아이들한테 투자를 해서 그 아이들이 대학을 가서 버는 돈이 사교육에 쓴 이상으로 많은 경우가 굉장히 드물다는 것을 알 수가 있는데요. 그럼에도 불구하고 왜 우리는 사교육에 대한 지출을 끊지 못하는 것일까에 대해서 몰간 하우젤에게 물어봤습니다.
In some ways, I can really empathize with, as a parent myself, my entire goal in life, I don't think that's an exaggeration, is to raise good kids and have happy kids. In some sense, successful kids. So that's why I want that more than anything. How much of my net worth would I be willing to spend to give my kids a better life? The answer is all of it. Because the alternative is I die with money in the bank and kids who could have had a better life. That to me is like the definition of hell. I don't want that at all. So I totally empathize with that. And you combine that in a system where, at least in the United States, tuition just explodes higher every single year. Like the inflation in tuition is completely ridiculous for a limited number of spots in the best universities. In a world in which you are told, at least, not always the case, that the only ticket to a successful career is a college degree. Again, not usually the case. At least some element of truth to that for most people. In that situation, when you combine all of those, you're going to have people that are making choices that, at least in hindsight, look very poor. This gets back to maybe where we started this conversation of like, money is not numbers and data and charts. It's emotions. And to many people, including myself, there's nothing more emotional than the well-being of your children. Nothing is more important than that. You, the elderly parent, are in poverty because you put your kids through school that like the payoff was so nebulous to begin with. Part of me shakes my head and says, yeah, that was a bad decision. Part of me says, I totally get it. And I might do the same thing in that situation. And so I think there are some problems like that like need a much more structural fix. It's not just like, how can we teach people to not do this? No, they're going to do that. Like people are wired to move mountains and make massive sacrifices to themselves to take care of their kids.
이번에 이제 몰간 하우젤이 쓴 신간의 제목이 Same as Ever입니다. 이 경제 역사를 공부해보면 공부할수록 세상에는 불황도 있고 호황도 있고 여러 가지 지표들이 올라갔다 내려갔다 하지만 경제를 움직이는 주체들, 즉 인간의 심리, 그 깊은 곳에 있는 원동력은 크게 변한 것이 없다라는 거죠. 그래서 이런 인간의 본성을 이해를 한 다음에 그 안에서 내가 어떻게 살아야 될지를 이해하는 것이 굉장히 중요하다는 얘기를 이 책에서 하고 있어요. 나는 어떤 삶을 살아야 행복하고 그 삶을 살기 위해서는 어떻게 내 경제를 디자인해야 되는가, 이런 식으로 생각이 가야지 일단 큰 돈을 벌면 모든 것이 해결되겠지라는 사고방식은 돈을 통해서 내 인생을 유복하게 행복하게 만들 수 없는 방법이다라고 얘기를 하죠.
What are some of the ways in which money can actually improve your human prosperity and happiness and flowering?
I think the biggest way that it can for most people is giving you a sense of independence and just freedom and control over your time. The clothes that I like might be different than you. The cars that I like might be different from somebody else. Independence is very universal as a source of happiness. And so if you can use your savings, your unspent money to give yourself freedom and autonomy, that I think is like, that's off to the races. And it's almost like in a selfish way, because spending money on clothes is like to show off for other people. Like you're doing it for other people. Spending money on freedom and autonomy is like, it's just for you. It's not for anyone else. No one else even knows about it. It's just for you and your family. And so that's what I've tried to do for myself. My wife and I live a good life. We live in a nice house and drive a nice car and wear decent clothes. But most of what we spend money on, our biggest expense, so to speak, is saving to make us independent. Charlie Munger said this himself. He said, I never intended to become rich. I just wanted to become independent. I view that as that's what I spend money on. And what I mean by that is I save and like I build money, invest, but I view that as spending money on autonomy and independence. And that to me has like a higher payoff, has a higher ROI than any material good that I could spend money on.
돈의 심리학 같은 경우에는 옆에 두고 그냥 쳐다봐도 괜찮은 책인 것 같아요. 이 책의 내용이 일단 내 머릿속에 있으면 약간 옳은 말만 하는 잔소리꾼 아버지가 내 머리 한켠에 있는 것 같은 느낌이 들거든요. 그래서 특히 내가 스트레스를 받거나 압박을 받아서 합리적이고 나한테 맞는 선택이 아닌 사회심리학적으로 내 마음이 요동쳐서 잘못된 경제적 선택을 할 것 같을 때 이 책의 내용을 한 번씩 상기해보면 도움이 될 것 같은 내용이라서 오늘 소개해봤습니다. 오늘 조승현의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 여러분 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.